I would like to welcome you to our Defunded Schools program. I'm so glad you could come and join us. We wanted the best to talk to you and tell you what's happening with it, and we do have the best here. Our next speaker is going to be Ted Kraig from WEAC.
Thank you. I am Regional Director for Region 7 of WEAC. So I work with teacher leaderships pretty much in this area, a number of other areas, but in Franklin, Greendale, Greenfield, Wauwatosa, Hartford area, and so on. So I see it sort of from the teacher's perspective and the parent's perspective. And kind of before I get started, I mostly want to talk about kind of the thing that Bob alluded to, movement, how we can change the environment that we're working in from one angle. Just a couple of preliminaries. How many people know who Diane Ramage is? If you haven't read Ramage and you're interested in like the topics we're discussing here, she really may be just the best in the business. She is a real historian of education. She's got all the data and the research handled as well as anybody you will ever hear. And it's just really compelling, her pushing back against what we're doing with our schools, which is setting them up for failure with a test and punish regime and then privatizing them, turning them over to operators who have all kinds of different motives. It's really compelling stuff. This particular book, Reign of Error, is just great if you want, like, here's the encyclopedia to go to for the data and what's really going on as far as quality in schools and what it means to privatize our public schools. This is a fantastic book, the best I've seen. A couple other things I'll just leave afterwards. One is just a very quick rundown of the budget and what it means for schools that we prepared in Region 7. And this isn't for everybody, but this is a sort of an in-depth read. The Progressive did a special issue on the people who are essentially scamming our schools, the operators that are trying to take over the schools. It has a number of really good articles on it, one by Bob's wife, Barbara Miner, about an outfit called Rocket Ship Schools that runs privately run charter schools, another on what they did in the New Orleans school district, where they created a recovery district and privatized most of the schools and fired 7,500 teachers in one blow, and are now bringing in basically inexperienced teachers. So if you want more in-depth reading, this is another really good resource. I have a number of copies here for people who want to do that. One update I also wanted to give, and I'm sorry for this, but I think this is kind of important for where things are and where they need to go. I went to a town hall forum last night with my state legislator, who happens to be Dale Kooyenga. Do people know who Dale Kooyenga is?
Yeah, boy.
Okay, so Kooyenga is supposed to be the next Scott Walker. I mean, he's this young guy, he's a rock veteran, he's very glib and very politically good, and you know, as conservative as Walker. I mean, really unbelievably conservative. And so I went to the town hall forum and I got an update from him. First thing he said, what are we doing with K-12 schools? And this is just really, to me, indicative of where we're at and why we need to think about longer haul. He said, well, we've heard from people, you know, all these joint finance committee hearings, and you know, we're going to have to do something about school funding for K-12. So here's what we're thinking about doing. We're going to take that $150 per pupil cut, the $127 million that was referenced by Dee, and we're going to remove that from the first year, and we'll probably put that cut into the second year. If we get more revenue, because there's going to be new revenue projections in April, we'll consider maybe reducing that cut or eliminating that cut in the second year if there's new revenue. If there's not, the cut comes in the second year. And what kind of bothered me, and the reason I'm bringing it up, is a number of people in the room, about 15 of us, got up and spoke and asked questions. I'd say about half a dozen said, thank you, Mr. Kooyenga. Thank you so much for doing this. You're restoring this funding. This is great. And we've got this issue where our expectations are abominably low. Yeah. You know, before Walker came into office, we used to talk in terms of scare stories about holding the revenue caps frozen. Because costs for things go up, right? The cost of health benefits for your employees go up, the cost of gasoline goes up, the cost of utilities goes up, the cost of everything goes up. A freeze is a cut. It creates a budget crisis for a school district. And people are thanking Kooyenga profusely for merely doing a freeze. And that's just abominable. We should not be thanking these guys for merely doing a freeze, and they're planning on doing probably worse. Interestingly, he said that they would move the cut, the 150 in categorical aid, the cut, you know, outside of the revenue caps. They would move that to the second year because they want to give school districts the time to plan and do operating referendums, and that this is local control. So those districts that don't do operating referendums, they must want to spend less on schools, have larger class sizes, have fewer supports for kids that are struggling. They must want that. Now, you know, the truth is what happens is it creates more inequality. right? The districts that can afford it are more likely to do operating referendums. I don't think in Milwaukee we're going to succeed with an operating referendum, right? We're just not an affluent place that's going to do that. So that's pretty reprehensible too, and that's currently the reality of where we are. The truth is a lot of people are fighting very vigorously against the school funding cuts and against handing over our schools to these private operators. But the legislature's really bad on this issue, and the governor's really bad on this issue, and we're probably going to have a budget result that is not good, and we have to start thinking about the long haul. So I just wanted to say that preliminarily. The angle I kind of wanted to talk about, because we've had people who've given you the details of what's going on with the budget and so on, is sort of a communications angle. That's sort of my background. I have a master's in rhetoric and communication. And I've thought a lot about this, and there's actually a statewide network which you can plug into. You can go to their website and get on their email list and get really detailed updates. It's called the Wisconsin Public Education Network. And it's a really cool thing that really came about after, I mean, it existed before, but not in the big open way that it does now. Basically, people from all kinds of different walks in education come to the table. It's school district administrators, like superintendents. It's school board members and their associations. It's us, the teachers. It's parent groups. And you go to any of these meetings, and usually there's a minimum of 40 people, sometimes a lot more, even 50, 60 people at these meetings from all over the state. And one of the things that they've done is they've created little work groups on different topics. And I was part of a work group just on sort of the communications part of this. And the reason that I think this is so crucial to talk about and for people to understand the project here is this. When it came to the gubernatorial election in 2014, how many people think that education was a big issue as far as how people voted? Can you raise your hand if you thought that was one of the top tier issues on why people voted?
Oh, no.
I mean, we all agree, right? I mean, this wasn't some big topic of discussion in any of the debates. You didn't see any 30-second ads. Other than the tagline, he cut $1.6 billion from schools. There was no discussion of this, right? Yet we've got this phenomenally radical agenda, right? Which, as Bob has especially emphasized, I mean, this is really about fundamentally transforming our schools, really defunding them and turning a lot of them over to private operators, like they've done in places like New Orleans and other places, especially in the Deep South. Well, interestingly, if you look at the research on where people are at, the WPR St. Norbert poll at the time in 2014, they asked people, who do you prefer on education issues? And by 50 to 42, people said Burke. So she was ahead on it, right? But only 6% of Burke supporters said they're supporting her for that reason. So 6% of people who went out and voted for Burke, that 48% or whatever it was, had education on their mind when they did that. Probably almost none of Walker's people had education on their mind. But the Marquette poll taken at the same time asked people, do you think we should increase support for K-12 education, money-wise? What would you say? Do you think a majority support that, a minority? What's your guess as far as how many people think we should increase funding for our schools in this state? 59% would like to increase funding. So a solid majority would really like to increase funding for our schools. And yet we elect a governor who is doing the opposite catastrophically, right? There's a lot of research that just shows this kind of stuff. The NEA has done some really cool polling. It's the kind of stuff I wish I had more access to. But they can do big polls, very scientifically done. And they ran this question by a group in a poll. And so you guys have to listen a little carefully. They said, I'm going to read you two statements. Please tell me which one you agree with more. First, some people say that politicians are failing our children by neglecting underperforming schools. The best way to improve these schools is to provide necessary resources, small classes, tutoring for struggling students, and intensive efforts to improve parental involvement. So do you prefer that? Or do you prefer other people say that underperforming schools are failing our children? The best way to improve these schools is to hold teachers and principals accountable for better results and to give parents more choice in which schools to send their kids. So which do you think wins, the choice or the let's invest in public schools?
The first one.
First one wins by 60 to 33. So, and this is really robust. I've seen this in multiple polls, asked in a lot of different ways. If you go to the general public, what do you think we ought to do? Take the schools the kids are in and make sure that they have the resources they need so that the struggling kids get extra attention, and there's one-on-one, that there's a rich curriculum where they get foreign language and art and music. Overwhelmingly, people say, let's do that rather than give parents choice and let's have competition. And yet we have a state government right now that is doing the opposite. So how is that happening? Why is that happening? So this has been talked about a lot on the network that, that I mentioned. It's a big problem that education is not a salient issue. Salient is, it's kind of political talk for what do people go out and vote on. So if you ask people, they say, sure, give more funding to the schools, but then when they go vote for their state legislator or governor, that isn't even on the radar screen as far as why they vote. So how can we change that? Nothing changes until we change that. So one angle of this, one part of this, is the communication. It is how we talk about these things. And it's widely agreed in the network table that we need to do a much better job as far as how we talk about these things. So let's face it, most voters went out and voted for this, and they have no idea what they voted for or what the implications are. And if we are not more effective, this budget's going to pass and do irreparable harm to our universities and our schools, right, our K-12 schools, and most people are not going to know it, right, unless we get a heck of a lot more effective as far as how we talk about it. Does that make sense? Yes. That's one part of the piece. The other part is what Bob's talking about. We need to build big coalitions. I mean, message itself isn't enough, but it's one part of it. So one document that we came up with that I think is kind of consensus, just even within my own organization to some extent, as far as some of the ways we need to look at these things. We prepared a document, just principles in how we do our communication. And I just want to talk about it really briefly. The first principle is this, is that we need to communicate for the long haul. One of our tendencies is a bad budget proposal comes up. We mobilize, we talk a lot, right? And then the budget goes away and we stop talking about it. There are no more forums about education. There's no more reports on education. We're not thinking about the long haul. And in the way that we're thinking about this needs to be more long haul. And specifically, we need to develop some themes, some examples, some metaphors, just the things we say we need to say more consistently and more broadly among us. I think it's widely agreed, and this is just part of what it is to not be right-wing. We're all free thinkers. We all think we have the best idea. I can be that way, right? You listen to what I'm saying, right? But this is the way people are, right, when they're educated especially. But we've got to figure out how to try to match the Republicans as far as saying some of the same things over and over and over again. And the reason is that you're not going to get through the noise if you don't do that. The second thing is we need to stay a step ahead of the argument. We need to make the arguments that are going to win when you think what happens down the line. So if you defend public schools, it makes sense to say public schools are the ones with licensed educators, with experienced educators and administrators, right? You need to pick the arguments that are going to succeed, steps down the line. The third is this, and this is where we can get a lot better. We tend to think research and numbers is persuasive, and it's really not. And it's really easy to confound research and numbers. You put up a study, they put up another. How does a person tell the difference if they're not really a wonk, which almost nobody is? So we need to start using really concrete examples. Does anybody know the metaphor hot coffee and what that means? Okay, so I see one hand. We got something called tort reform in this country in many states, right? And tort reform basically denies people the right to get damages when a corporation like kills somebody. We need to come up with examples that we use over and over again, and maybe we can get into that at some point. The fourth point is that there's very good research that shows when you're talking about privatizing schools, the best angle in is to talk about handing over control of the schools. That essentially you're giving it to people who can't be trusted, that these are our schools, run by our locally elected boards. We have control over them. We're giving up control when we turn them over to private charter operators or to voucher operators. The fifth is we need to have a positive aspirational vision. We can't just be defenders of the status quo. The status quo is not good enough. Let's face it, 4 years ago we weren't that happy with what was going on with public education funding. We need to actually justify real investment in our schools and world-class schools. And then the sixth is we just have to constantly be on the attack. And sometimes when you're on the attack against your opponent's ideas, you can sow the seeds for the positive things you want to do. By talking about privatization, we can really explain the virtues of public education and why it was established in the first place. If you look at what the Republicans did with the Affordable Care Act, it's a really good model. They lost, but they didn't just give it up there. They worked like day and night to discredit it, and they're continuing to work to try to turn it around. We have to take that attitude as far as what they're doing to our universities and K-12 schools. So I'll cut it off right there. I can start giving you some of these examples, but I'll spare you. You'll find a lot of them in this Progressive Magazine article, right? And I appreciate the time to talk with you.